I'm going to be demonstrating the Toronto landscape tutorial demonstration here, giving you a step-by-step example of how to create a very colorful, highly saturated Toronto landscape in a few easy steps. So I'm going to demonstrate that for you right now. Starting off, we have a piece of 100% cotton watercolor paper laid out on a piece of masonite board here, just with some masking tape, sealed nice and tight so you don't get any water or paint getting underneath the edges here. So you have a nice crisp border once it's done. I've got my palette here, to which I will add some colors in just a second. I'm going to start first though with a sketch, just so we know where things are going to be. We want to have things 1/3 up here. Nice light sketch, don't want it too hard because otherwise we're going to see the pencil marks once it's done. So just a rough idea. You're going to have some buildings here. I'm just putting a few marks just so I know how I'm going to lay it out. Sky Dome, I guess that's the Rogers Center as it's called now, somewhere about here. CN Tower will go up about here. The observation deck is about there. The smaller one is up here. Just as a guide. I don't want to make the sketch too strong because I'm going to be painting over it later and I want the pencil marks to disappear. Now the brush I'll be using, this is a very cheap $3 brush. It's called a Royal Soft Grip. Nylon bristles. They're very effective. It's almost as good as a much more expensive Escoda brush that I have. So if you're trying to save money on brushes, you can get some very good brushes for not a lot of money. More expensive are the bigger mop brushes. You can save up for some of those. They're good to have, but you can do quite a bit with these cheap brushes. And it all comes down to personal preference, so try a few out. If you have the money, get some nice brushes, just test out, see what you like. It's good to have options, but for this tutorial I'm going to use a very basic brush that I do in the demos, just so I'm using the same equipment that you are. I'm not taking any shortcuts here. So I'm going to start getting some paint here. We're going to be using some magenta. Now I'm using Core. Core is one of my favorite brands. A lot of watercolor paints are made with gum arabic, but this is made with something called Aquazol, which allows the pigment to go further and the paint to last a bit longer than the other brands, which the pigment isn't quite as dense because it's using gum arabic. So I'm going to get a little bit of magenta there. And we're also going to use some transparent pyrrole orange. So lots of warm colors in the center and the cooler colors will go out to the side. Now I don't need a whole lot because the paint goes a long way, as you will soon see. And next, we'll try some nickel azo yellow, also by Core. Again, a very intense yellow that goes a long way. And for getting into our cooler colors, I've got some Cobalt Teal blue. This is Winsor Newton. It's also a very good brand. It's not quite as dense as Core, but it's kind of creamy and also highly regarded by many watercolor painters. And then to fade out to the edges, gonna have some, well, I could do ultramarine. I'll do ultramarine. Here's some M. Graham. This is made with honey as it's one of its mediums. It makes it softer, stays kind of wet on the palette. So I'll have that for the edges of the painting. So we've got those 5 basic colors, and I'm going to start with wetting the paper. Now the idea here is I'm going to create a little bit of a white area in the middle, just as if the sun is setting here, so that area won't get any pigment. You can fill this in if you want to. You can just have a different kind of sunset, but I want to have a bit of white that will really accentuate the landscape here. So I'm just going to go ahead and wet the whole thing except for this strip here. Now this is when a bigger brush comes in handy, because you can wet the whole area in one stroke. Now I don't want it too wet. I don't want it to be dripping, so it's dripping a bit here. I'm going to get rid of some of that. Okay, now I'm ready for the paint. I'm going to start with the yellow. That's going to be my brightest colors. And you'll see as you lay that on, it just flows right out. This is one of the greatest moments in a watercolor painting, when you lay down these washes and you just watch that paint disperse. You know, you want to manipulate it as little as possible. You want to let it flow. It's a very meditative exercise, this whole process. Now I'm going to try and soften these edges a bit. And next I'm going to go with the orange. Now I'm trying not to make it too uniform here. Now, I'm not just drawing a straight line. I want it to have a bit of natural effect to it. I don't want any clumps of paint either. So I want it smooth, but I don't want to see the brush strokes. If I make a brush stroke and I see it, I want to smooth it out in the water. And I want it fairly concentrated, because when it dries, it's going to be a lot lighter than it seems at the moment. So I'm getting a nice bleed there. All the colors are bleeding together. Now next I'm going to go to my magenta here. Next layer up. Again, stop it from falling down too much here. Now ideally this would be on a flat surface, but since I have to demo it, it's up on a slant here. I suppose I could put the camera up high, but that would take some doing, so we'll have to do with what we have for now. So a little bit more magenta here. Just get, and again, mix it in with the orange. Keep a irregular line there. You don't want to just do one line across, because that's going to look too uniform, too static. Now next, bit of the cobalt here. This is when we start to get into our cool colors to fade out to the edge. And I'm going to take it right to the edge, because then I'm going to mix in the darker ultramarine blue at the very end. And last bit of teal, and get a bit more teal in there. And finally the ultramarine blue. Which is nice and dark, giving us a nice fade out to the edge. Mix it in with the cobalt a bit, the teal rather. might just get a bit more ultramarine to balance the top and the bottom. As you can see, it's a bit lighter down here. We want to have it nice and dark. When you have it dark at the bottom, it gives an effect as if it's receding. You get a three-dimensional receding into the background effect where the lighter colors are. So let's make this a bit darker here. I'm going to try and start doing some wave effects. We'll do more of this later, but a bit more ultramarine. Still not quite dark enough. I'll match it up here a bit too. And again, remember, I'm constantly moving the brush, trying to create some natural looking brush strokes. Again, you know, often you see people that just do one line, and that's what you don't want to have. Okay, now it's dripping a bit into my whites here. I'm going to get a Kleenex here or paper towel, and I'm going to sop that up. And if I do that while it's still wet, I'll get a nice cloud effect. As you can see there. And even up here, I can add a few cloudy looking textures as well, just to make it a bit more interesting. You don't want to go overboard with it, but a few little splotches will give you a nice cloudy sunset look. So I'm going to start with a bit of the blue here. I'm going to mix it a little bit with some red. Now, if you want to keep it simple, you can just go with the blue, but I want to mix a bit with the red, because the idea is that the blue and the red are both providing their light onto the buildings. So if we just have one of those colors, then we're missing the completeness of the scene. I could even use a little bit of yellow, throw that in as well, just to make it more harmonized. So I can still see a bit of the line here, so I'm going to go along my line. You can use a ruler for this if you like, if you're really worried about getting a crooked line. But I'm just going to wing it here. You don't have to do it all in one go, you can do bit by bit. Got a little bit there. So there I've got a pretty straight line. And now I can start just doodling some buildings in there. I don't want to keep it uniform. Keep them up and down, up and down. You know, Toronto has had a lot of new building in the past 10 or 15 years or so, so there's a lot of skyscrapers, a lot of big condos down on the harbor. So we want to give an impression that there's a lot of big buildings there, different sizes and shapes. You know, they don't have to be completely rectangular. You can be a bit impressionistic with it. Just something interesting for the eye to look at. We're going to go over again later with another pass, so don't worry too much about getting it perfect the first time. Another way you can do it is do it on the side of the brush, and you get a more easy building shape. Maybe a few taller ones here. And now here's the sky dome. Because also when it dries, it's not going to be as dark as it appears now. Okay, now I've got a bit of bleeding here, but I'm going to go in and I'm going to create a very thin line to represent the reflection. So I'm doing a few little lines just to give the look of waves. Anytime there's a bigger building, you can go a bit further out with this. Here's the CN Tower, so that's the biggest one. So this is a brush stroke we're using where we do small, thick, small, thick, small, thick. So for the biggest waves are going to be at the front. So I'm going to go small, thick, small, thick, small, thick, small, thick, small, thick. And as you go into the background, you're going to run out of paint, and the waves are going to get fainter and fainter, which is what we want, and thinner too. So don't go quite as deep when you press down the brush. Just have a little bit of the tip, and keep your brush strokes wavy. Not too wavy. This can take some practice. You know, this is a bit more advanced, so don't go all the way if you're too worried about it, or just practice it before you try it. As long as we have some at the bottom here to indicate waves coming towards us, then that'll do just fine. Extra dark down here, a bit more blue. Because the darker it is, the closer to us, then the more it's going to look three-dimensional. A bit darker at the top, that'll give the crest of the wave. So, there we go. That's pretty convincing for some water, I think. Now, next we're going to go back into the cityscape here. I'm going to add a little bit more color in there, maybe a bit of teal, and just kind of mix that. It's still a bit wet, so I'm just going to mix little elements of this together just to make it a bit more interesting. It's going to blend with what's on the paper as it is. It's still a little bit wet, so it's going to mix together. If you get too much, if you take a dry brush and just absorb the paint, you can dilute what's there a bit and get some of it away if it's really, see, it's getting a bit chunky over here, so I'm going to try and gonna get some paper towel and blotch that off a bit. You know, we don't want our attention going over here, so this can be a bit blurry, that's okay. Same over here, we don't need a lot. You know, we want our attention towards the CN Tower here. So don't worry if this doesn't have detail. That can be a mist coming in. So I'm going to do the same with a little bit of magenta, just so we have some multiple colors there, just so it's not a boring, flat looking color as our skyline. Just a little bit. If you do too much, just sop it up. So this is to use only at the very end. I'm going to just put a little bit of this down. Grab some on the very tip of the brush and just go through, make little highlights as if there's little orange lights down. Down by the street here. You know, as if there's stuff going on. Cars driving around. Billboards lit up. We're going to come by again with another pass with a white pen, so this is not the end of the line. This just gives us some illusion of detail without having to go in and paint every window and every nook and cranny of the buildings here. Gives a nice illusion without having to do a lot of extra detail. Can put a bit here. You want the brush fairly dry too as you're doing this. So, okay, that works pretty well. And next I'm going to go in with the white pen here. It's a bit of a trick. It's not always smiled upon among watercolor painters, because you ought to do it the other way around by putting in liquid frisket, masking off the areas you're going to add, but this is a nice quick way to get the idea without a lot of forethought, especially if you want to correct things, or it's good to have. So just a few little accents. Don't go nuts with it. Just to give some lights at the bottom. You know, if you have some lights at the bottom, it'll accentuate the road down there. Some street lights. You know, something on the sky dome here, some reflection. Gives a bit of shape to it. Imagine some signs. Here's the Gardner Expressway, so there's a lot of action going on here. Some windows. And I think I'm going to go through, I think I will use that red after all. Okay, this is called P-roll red light. Just grab a bit of that. And again, just like the orange, I'm going to go through, just add a few little dots here and there. Just give some nice highlights to the city line. And in fact, I'm going to do one more thing before we finish this. These are all the red lights. People stopped along the way. I'm going to go one more time. I'm going to get some of this cobalt, or not cobalt, rather. Yeah, Cobalt Teal. Again, not too diluted. Just make some little... these dots will contrast with the red and the orange so that it'll stand out more. There's not a lot of cobalt teal lights and such, but it just gives a nice contrast to the reds and the oranges, so this skyline will stand out and not just fade into the background. It's good on the edge of here, the edge of the CN Tower. So that should about do it. Maybe a little bit more white over here, because we've got the dome. Just a bit of accent, because this is our focal point right here, so we want to make most of the high contrast elements in this area. Some nice straight lines. So a lot going on there. Okay, I think this should be about it. Now I'm going to remove palette. Now this part you got to be very careful. You got to take the edge and you want to pull it sideways. If you yank it like this, then sometimes you can rip the paper a little. So you want to do this slowly and from the side. And there. Toronto skyline. A few easy steps. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial and look forward to seeing you next time.